Oh, greetings and salutations. Uh, this is CptWoozle. It is 8:17 p.m. on January. Oh, it's February now. February 5th, 2024. Um, so I wanted to take a brief break this week and try to talk about a few things and lay some groundwork. This is still all going to be programming code. So one of the things that has kind of come up recently that I don't know if it's discussed very well. I know that there are a bunch of articles that talk about it, but I don't know if everyone always explains in detail how you might lay out applications, so forth and so on. So I wanted to kind of go over the basics of like a .NET Core program that uses, clean architecture. Um, so um, let's see if we can come up with something real quick. Um, found for something, and we'll command line it all here and kind of document it and put it up, and then people can kind of lay it out for themselves. Hopefully, there are existing projects out there that lay this out for you, um, and then you can kind of use those as kind of a approach. Let me have some of the commands already. Let me open up a new .NET. So here's an example of what your application might look like and how you can set it up. Let's see. Uh, so here's how you might set it up. Um, I set mine up in a similar way. I have other projects, and you don't have to do this. Um, so we'll kind of step through how you might set this up in um, and let's go ahead and get the commands and everything going as well. So this is how you might set up a clean architecture project. One of the things that I think people struggle with, not everyone, but some people, beginning developers, I suppose, struggle with, and maybe even some middle tier developers struggle with, is you want to build a project from scratch. And you've been working with, let's say, a project or a company, or maybe even you graduated from a boot camp or a college. And if you're lucky, you've gone to, you've experienced, all right, I've needed to build an application from scratch. But oftentimes, you'll come into a project that has already been designed and laid out and taking care of a lot of things for other people. Hopefully, you're curious and you want to know like why they set these things up, and you take the time to tear apart the program and do all of those things. But oftentimes, I would say that I don't know if people have. So I think it behooves developers to kind of build something on their own that they feel passionate about or interested about. I would say for your very first project out of the gate, when you're doing your own, it's something that you're interested in, um, and something that you have an interest for. I I would say your very very first project should probably be something that you're passionate about, just so you can kind of cut your teeth and you won't lose interest. And then after you've been doing and making projects and working on things a while, you go through some of the boring pieces. So as an example of that, even for myself, um, they I am building a reverse bullet hell for those who follow this channel, and I've hit a point where I have to do the boring pieces. One of the boring pieces that I'm going to have to do is actually make the maps myself. I'm not doing those on stream because they're pretty boring, but I think that, you know, there's just a point where I'm going to have to build the maps manually. On that same note, you're going to have to do something similar over here. So I'll kind of break down. I'll keep this over here to the left, and I'll open up a new tab. I don't think. Yeah, we'll create a secondary tab. We'll actually move you into Visual Studio Code. And let's open up a new. Let's open up a folder. I'm not going to show my folder structure on the screen. Let's go with sample.net. Sample.net. So this will be the folder that will kind of work from. Just drag it over into our main screen. Here we go. So we'll call it our folder structure file. And I'm used to JavaScript, so I want to call it folder structure with a lowercase. So we'll do folder underscore structure dot text and then we'll create our commands dot text. And hopefully you can find all of these somewhere else. Somebody who has also poked at or written about these things or streamed about these things, and they walk you through this process. I'm going to put all of this up as kind of a README for people who are interested in kind of the commands and walkthrough. So this is kind of the general folder structure that one might take when one's building an application like this. So what you're going to run into folder structure wise is here's going to be your API. You're going to break it out into your controllers, your properties, your www root for serving static files. It's kind of well documented. Your app settings are where you might keep information about your project. And inside there might be things like your logging levels. If you're using auth0, you might keep your information for that there. Cores, and for those who don't know, hopefully everyone who's watching this stream knows, you need to give your backend permission to return information from URLs that are different. So if you're running, let's say, on localhost, or more so if you're running on, I don't know, let's say www.test.com, you need to give www.example.com permission to connect to your API running on www.test.com. You can, of course, just blanketly allow everything, but that's kind of not a really good secure approach. Your program.cs is where you're going to keep things like your DB context if necessary, your services as you scope them, your controllers, and it's just the controller information. Generally, you wouldn't literally keep them in there. Any authentication settings you have, do your setup, so forth and so on. So that's where you keep that. I don't necessarily know if you always need an application layer on this particular one. I usually swap this out with, say, like a common solution, and it depends on the individual. So I would say you might do a / your solution name .common, and inside your common folder you might keep any dependencies, helpers, so forth and so on. So that's what I tend to do, and everyone kind of has a slightly different approach to this. So I keep here like classes that I think, or models that I think are going to be shared, I also do helpers here. So you have that. Um, I also keep my DTOs up here, and some people feel strongly about it being completely separated. Um, and I sometimes question even myself, and maybe there's someone who I would ask, like, why do we have on the application layer and the domain layer, why are there interfaces here and they're separate? And I'm sure somebody knows. I don't always know. I don't think this is going to answer that question. Inside your infrastructure, you keep your data, which will keep your configurations, as well as, and they don't include it here, you'll keep your migrations. So you'll keep your migrations here as well. If you have any repositories, if you're using Entity Core, you don't necessarily need this. I keep my migrations in my data folder, but some people again feel strongly about moving it other places. And then of course you have your tests. So let's kind of step through the commands that one might come across. So we'll do the first one. We have our .NET new, and one of the things that's probably a little weirder depending upon which environment you're coming from is the fact that we'll go back to the folder structure, that we kind of keep all of this in a giant solution. And this is just the API. This isn't even the front end. So this is just your very complicated, and each of these are their own individual projects. So we'll call this, I don't know what we're going to call it. I guess we could call this .NET sample. So this will be, you'd run your solution, and then you would, if you wanted to, you would probably set up your API. So this would be the next command. You do your .NET wet API. I like to keep my folders actually a little simpler named, if you will. So let me pull mine up. And so I actually don't like to keep them in this type of folder structure, though some people can. I actually prefer to keep them in just their original folder names. So like I would just do API. So it would be .NET sample.api, and I would just put it in the API folder. And I'll kind of show you what that looks like. Here, let's run this real quick. Let's make our solution, make directory, and we already have one. Let's do sample. So cd code, cd sample, there it is. And so we would create our solution file, and you see it over here to the left. You have your .NET solutions file. And from here, if we were to do this next command here, it would go ahead and create it into our API folder. I like this folder. It keeps the structure keeps it a little simpler for me personally. Not everyone's like that. So that would create the API level of the application. And in here, it's already going to, at least in the version of .NET that I'm in, some people's are on an older version, they use startup rather than program. In here is going to be your program. Now, the way that this comes set up already for you is a base weather forecast API. So you can kind of use this to start with, but it can be a little confusing to start. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this video, is because I ran into this myself when I was first building my applications, and it didn't feel great. So and I'll put in some notes here. You would replace this with your own um, solution name. And we'll literally say replace with your own sample name. I like using the folder names without the solution. This can be changed by replacing, and again, hopefully everyone investigates this, replacing the parameter after the -0. So that's there's going to be your API project. We'll do the next piece over here, and this is for your application layer. And this is, again, if you want to. This creates a separate class library, and again, like I said, I like to do without this. So that would be my application layer. This one would be my domain layer over here. And then we'll do the infrastructure layer. And I think, let's go back and take a look. I think there are a couple more layers that I created. I know one of them is common. And let's put them actually in alphabetical order. So here's your common. Let's go back to our folder structure. So we have API, common, application, domain, infrastructure. And we didn't do tests. But we can. Give me a second. I had prepared a little bit of this in advance. So I'm just reading through the notes that I made. I apologize. All right. So, and so let's double check one thing. So there's your application, your common, your infrastructure. And we need one other thing. Yeah, we'll add in that. Yep, there we go. So we'll add the test to this afterwards. So here are the individual. This will create our individual folders and projects for everything. Let's go ahead and run those in our project. Infrastructure, application, yeah. And then the last one is infrastructure. So this creates them here. Now, you can create them on the UI. I don't find it nearly as fast, but everyone's different, and maybe someone can. So what you would normally do is you need to add references now to all of these projects. So here we are with our various folder structure, as you can see here. And you can either do this via command line, or so we'll modify a couple of things here. We have our .NET reference. So you can either do your solution name, and say application dot your solution, and that'll add a reference to it. And so let's see. We don't need to go up a directory. We can just say We can add a reference to application. Oh, fiddlesticks. I've done something. I forgot to replace my name. Look at me. It's supposed to be this. See? There we go. And it's going to be folder structure is just going to be application. There we go. So let's actually drop application. Let's delete you. Let's delete you. Let's delete you. And delete you. Let's rerun those again. DR, nothing's in here. Paste anyway. See, and I feel like this is a bit faster than having to manually do it yourself. So we'll add the two. We'll add in our reference and our application. And let's go ahead and do that. Yeah. From our base folder directory, paste. .NET add a reference to infrastructure. I think we can just do infrastructure. Let's see. Slash. Yeah. Cannot find any project in. Is it /? Is it going to force me to slash? I wonder. We should be able to add a reference. And the project path is API. Is it going to be? Oh, that's weird. Well, let's do API slash. I think it is .NET sample.api.cs proj. Huh. Let's double check. App settings. So ./.NET sample. I wonder if it's going to ding me on that. Well, this works just fine. So let's do infrastructure. I'm going to be really grumpy if it really cares that much. I'm always grumpy about, maybe I just misspelled something. No. But I can do it inside the folder. Oh, that seems silly. Yeah, all right. That's fine. So let's add some notes here inside the API folder, and we can just do slash. We did API slash .NET sample API.cs proj. And what this should do is we need to then add it in here to the we need to add in to the solution our various pieces. So we've added a reference, and yeah, here are my notes. There we go. Let's come back up here. Add these projects to the solution so the solution can see them. Let's do that. Add projects to the solution. So source your solution name. So we should be able to do, in this particular instance, it's just API. Let's see if we can just do this. DR. Yeah, there we go. So that you don't have to go through and do the whole thing. Mine's just, it's just application, then infrastructure, domain. It's API, application, domain, infrastructure, and I forgot common. Now again, I don't claim to be an expert in all of this. So then you have our, cool. So now all of your projects are added to the solution. And then from our API itself, we might want to add references to the other projects so they can access them. I don't think I have anything in here. So let's go to our API project. And when we go to look at our API CSproj, we want to, yeah, we don't need a this project reference here. What we do is we want to create project references to the other, projects. Let's come back here. Yeah. So add project solution, add references to the other projects as needed. So for the API, we want to add a reference, say, to probably common. So we would go up a folder and say we want to add a reference to common, and we want to add a reference to probably application and infrastructure. Or the add reference as needed for the API. For the API project, we want to cd to API and run the following. So we have all of this, and then we would just go over here to our API project. Yeah, there we go, and add a reference to the other projects as needed. Let's double check that. Yeah, there we go. And now from the infrastructure directory, we want to add an application, and we probably, again, you probably want to add for the infrastructure project, we want to add in common and application. We want to add in common and application. And common's probably going to be added everywhere. And for the application project, we probably want to add in common, and we want to add in domain. And this is the other reason why I shortcutted the names. It's just easier to reference them rather than having to type all of that out. So we go up a folder, and we want to go into the infrastructure folder. I can spell it right. Yep, and like I said in the notes, we want to add common and application. And then we're going to go up one directory, and we want to go into application, cd dot dot slash application. And we want to do the same thing. We want to add in common and domain. Paste. Now, we at this particular point, we have a couple different choices. We would add an entity framework. I think this is kind of where most .NET projects these days are going to head, is the entity framework. It's pretty neat. But you'd add that in to the infrastructure layer. So go to the infrastructure folder and run the following. So I'm going to use Postgres. Now you don't have to. You would replace this with whatever you're going to use. So you'd replace this with whatever. Replace this with whatever DB library you want to use. So from here, let's go up a directory to our infrastructure. Infrastructure, if I remember how to spell it, yeah. And from here, we would run these to add in our entity framework. It's grumpy about something. I wonder why. Let's just add one. Unable to create dependency graph file for project. Let's take a look at what we have. Infrastructure, project reference. I don't see anything unusual about it. Store project walk path. Circular dependency. Let's take a look at you. I don't think we have anything here. Common domain. I don't think I see anything here that's unusual. That's weird. Let's take a look at something. Let's reopen this. New window. Let's reopen it as a project. I guess we already are. I wonder why you're being so troublesome. That's weird. Let's take a look at that. I wonder why. Let us Google and find out. I wonder if it's because we have a similar project reference, but we don't have anything in here. Guess we can clean up infrastructure and remove some stuff, but let's take a look first. Infrastructure.NET sample. I don't have anything. Unless it's that. Let's double check something. Common application. Yeah, all right. I think it was just me. I think I left something in there that I shouldn't have. Let's try that again. There we go. Yep. So there's our framework. Let's add in the other one. Let's add in design. And let's add in our Postgres. And from here, we can actually do a .NET build if we wanted to do the solution. But let's go up the folder. Let's go up. Let's go to our API folder. And we can actually do .NET Run and see what other errors we generate, if any. There we go. Looks like we're running along, chugging, and we're good. So now we have this running at localhost. Localhost 5126. I don't have any Swagger set up or anything. So this kind of creates the bare minimum for you. Now, if we wanted to, we could do new unit tests for all of these. So I'm going to suggest off the top of my head using XUnit, but other people prefer others. Here's what you might do. So you'd say .NET new XUnit. You'd create, so our solution name is called .NET sample. And it would be .NET sample.api.tests, and we're going to throw it into here. So this will create our .NET XUnit tests, and I believe you can do the same thing with in-unit tests. So we'll do API, we'll do all the other 5 directories. So we have .NET sample. Let's close all of these so that we can see them all. API, application, common, domain, and infrastructure. And we'll do the same thing over here. Application, common, domain, infrastructure. All right. And then we'll add the solutions, all of these, to our tests. So we'll grab all of you. Let's come back over here to our command line. And we'll paste all of these in here. There we go. And we'll do our last one. Cool. So it creates our tests here for each of the pieces. And you, again, don't have to name them that. We do need to add these projects, though, as individual ones to our solution. So we'll take this here. We'll replace it with this. And we could just do them one by one. So our solution is named, tests.NET sample. And you don't actually have to do the whole .cs proj unless you want to, as far as I can tell. You could just point it to the directory, and as long as there's only one CS proj in there. But let's test it real quick. Cool, yeah, so let's go ahead and do the others. I think I'm missing one. I did API. I got application domain common. I forgot common. Yeah, there we go. If I can spell and get my copying and pasting right. So we'll just grab the rest of these and paste. And there we go. So replace whatever. Add unit tests. Add tests to the solution. Rename as necessary. And over here, add your tests to the solution. So now we have our commands, and we would normally from here, we would need to add references to the projects. So add references to the individual projects from the test libraries. And so as an example of that, we'll go in the tests. We'll go into .NET Sample API tests, and as an example, we would add a reference. We would say from your API tests folder, which would be tests / .NET Sample / API .tests. We would do this. We would add a reference to .NET Sample .api, and I didn't call mine source, so we would just go up a directory and it would just be API. And let's make sure this works before we put it out on the web. We're in the folder. Yeah, there we go. So we would just, etc., etc. And we could then test, based upon what we wanted to do. Now, one of the other things that I ran across in this particular piece was some of the pieces that I needed to know how to lay out my folder structure. So as an example, what you would do is, now because it doesn't give you the internal folders, we do have the general structure in here from our folder structure. But for instance, you would come in here and you'd create controllers. And inside your controller, you might do something along the lines of a user controller.cs. And inside of here, we would, of course, namespace it. So we do namespace, and I think we called it .NET Sample. Excuse me, .NET Sample .api .controllers. So that would be our base. So .NET Sample .api .controllers, and then from here we might add in whatever pieces we want to know. So if we're using core .interfaces, we might I've capitalized in the wrong spot. If we're using authorization, we would do Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authorization. And if we're using MVC, and again, these are all questions of what you're using, and depending upon what particular tool you're using, oops, I'm sorry. Depending upon what particular tool you're using, whether it be Visual Studio Code or fully qualify. And I guess we could do that. I don't know if you need it, but depending upon what it is that you're setting up and how you're setting it up, you might um, change some of the stuff around. Hold on a second. It looks like our CSproj file is being weird. Common application swashbuckle. And as I was saying, it depends on your what you're working on. So you have Open API. We're not using the framework. I'm using .NET 8 for mine. Yeah, I don't have anything else. But it's grumpy about our core usage. But depending upon what it is that you are, I think. Yeah, we're fine here. Depending upon what particular interface you're using, whether it be Visual Studio Code or Rider, if you're a JetBrains person, or Visual Studio, it will help you with all of this. So you don't necessarily have to master it all, but I would strongly suggest that you kind of get an understanding. So this might be a base route for you. And that means that when we access this, we would access it by going to the base URL /API and then the name of our controller, and we say that by saying controller, and that would prepare us there. And then you'd have your in this instance you might have a public class. We'd have our user controller. And now normally you would have an iUser services. And again, this is up to you. iUser service, and it would be your user service. There are two different ways in which you can approach this. So let's do controller base. Yeah. There are two different ways in which you can approach this. You can do this approach, which puts everything in here, or you can do this other approach, which would be public class user controller, and it takes controller base. Where are you? There you are. Controller base, and then inside you create your dependencies, and it's up to you. And different people are different. Different companies are different, so that's what you may see as well. And in here we could create our first login post. So we'll have our public task, public async task, an iAction result, and we might have our login. Now in my particular instance, I am not doing anything special here, but let's say you wanted to get some information from the body. You might have the string email address here, and your string for your password. That's what you might have if you were going to head down this path, and you then could return and await your user service dot login if you had something along those lines, and pass along your email and your password. So this is an example of how you might start. Now again, usually you might do things like add in some checks for email address and password. And again, there are a bunch of different like middleware, for instance, that you could put in here to kind of help with this. As an example, in here, you could add in some global error handling that catches, something along those lines. But I would generally strongly suggest that don't just pass along the email address and password. That's kind of a beginner mistake. Something along the lines of, make sure the email address is populated. And again, there's middleware that can help you with this, so that instead of going this particular path, you might use something like a DTO, which we see mentioned here in our folder structure here. So in your application layer, you might have a DTO, and that might look along the lines of something like this. So in our application layer, we create a new folder. These are DTOs. Inside here, we would have let's call it the login DTO.cs. And for our login DTO, it might look something along the lines of this. Login DTO. And we would say required. And this just lets it know that, we want, it's a required field, public string email address. We would, of course, correct you to the email address, get set, and then the public string for password, get set. Now we're missing a few things in here, so we need to correct it. So right off the bat, when you're doing this in Visual Studio Code, it's not nearly as helpful as others. Others allow you to do things like right-click and say like new class, and it will populate a lot of this stuff for you. But if you're doing it by hand, it would be .NET sample we're on the application layer DTOs. And so that would be our namespace. And to use required, though hopefully it will help you with this, it will offer you, there you go. And again, some people are particular that they want namespace above annotations. It's a question that I can't say 100%. It's up to you. You could start this off as saying is equal to string.empty. And it doesn't like that. It prefers lowercase string.empty. And same thing with this. Now you don't have to declare this as a string.empty. You can just let it be nullable, and it will be grumpy about it, because it will be grumpy about it. But some people prefer, and it does reduce your warnings by, as you can see, taking out this kind of general, by having it set up this way, where you set it to string.empty, rather than just leaving it blank. It makes it grumpy, and it tells you there's a nullable property, must contain a non-null value. When exiting constructor, consider declaring the property as nullable. And you can just do that by doing this, and that would make it nullable. So either give it a definition or make it nullable. That just gets rid of your warnings. I don't think it's a big deal, but some people do. And I think, it's a discussion amongst your team. But once you shared that or created that particular DTO, then you can come over here and say, instead of using string email address and password, you could just say login DTO and then login DTO. Or whatever you want to name it. So you could say login details, and then down here you could do login details dot email address and login details dot password. So one of the things that you can run into with, and what's nice about using a DTO with, say, a required, is that depending upon how you have your middleware set up, it will catch this for you. So you kind of have a choice there. You can use existing DTOs and have it catch this information for you, or set up middleware to kind of help you with that. Either there's not like a right or wrong way to do it. I think people will disagree with that, but like for your first projects, as you're kind of building this stuff, it's good to kind of explore and try things out and look things up and kind of try to figure out how some of this stuff comes together. Now, some who might be viewing this stream might ask, well, you added authorize and API controller up here. How would that play into the program.cs? Right now, we don't have anything set up here, so let's clean up right off the bat some of this stuff, because we don't actually need the weather forecast information from them. We'll clean you up as well, and we actually don't have any Swagger, so we don't really have to worry about that. I'm not going to show how to set up the DB context this round, but what you can do, and what I tend to do, is the following. Is right up here after right up here, you also don't need the builder services add endpoints explorer. This is only if we're doing Swagger, which we're not. So we create our builder, and what I tend to do is something along the lines of this. And I'll put it up here. Is I actually use this to say whenever we get an invalid, and this is what I meant earlier when I said you could add in middleware. This will go ahead and compare the model that you see here, this login DTO, to the information that is passed in, and if it is bad, it will send back an error for me. So this is one of the things that you can kind of implement, so that you don't have to manually go through and do checks every time against, hey, did they put in an email address? Did they put in a password? But this also adds the controllers for you. So once you've added this, it will go ahead and find all of your controllers in your API, so you don't have to go through. Now, if we were to do something like add in a service or something along those lines, just kind of continuing down the path of what this might look like, you would come over here to, let's clean up some of this stuff, because it gives you a bunch of extra stuff in here that you don't really need. So in our application layer, let's give it a class. But let's say you wanted to kind of flesh this out a little bit more. You've got the general gist down. You know that you've built your first controller, and then from here, let's say you're like, all right, well, how might I add in the quote-unquote service? And again, this is just following the general approach of, say, clean architecture. Let's clean this up as well. You would usually break it up into kind of two different pieces. So in your infrastructure layer, you would have your actual service, and then in the core layer, or domain layer, depending upon how you have it set up, you would put your infrastructure. So let's close some of these, close our commands, and you can kind of see here, based upon the general folder structure that we already laid out, where things might go. So here is where our services would go. So it's kind of just follow along. We come over here to our infrastructure. We do a new folder. We'd say services. That's where our services would go. And then you would build or connect it to your interfaces that you might keep in the domain. So we would say interfaces here. And let's just kind of walk through what an interface might look like. So we have up here in our controller, we have an iUser service. And let's say we want to now add in our interface for this particular controller. So it would just be a new file, and we would do I user service is what I tend to do, .cs. And again, depending upon which particular tool you're using, and Visual Studio Code might have some helpers that I'm not using. But if you don't have access to that, it's just going to be, again, the name of your project. So mine is, what is it, .NET sample namespace. Hold on a second. I got to remember what our namespace is. Yeah, there it is. So our namespace is .NET sample .domain .interfaces. And then in here for our user service, we would do I public interface user service, which is what ours is called, and we would just create our first piece. Now, I didn't specify here on the user controller what I would be returning, and this is a preference question for you as a user. If you want to, you can actually choose to return information whenever a user does something. So for instance, let's say we wanted to actually return our user object. We would come in here, and we didn't create our user. It's one of the reasons why I didn't do it. You might come in here and say, we're returning a user. We'd need to go ahead and create that user object, but our user class, and I didn't do that yet, but let's say we're going to return a user. That means that when we come over here, or if we were going to return multiple users, it would be something along the lines of, I enumerable user, and then we'd need another, something along those lines. But we're not. We're just going to return the base user. And again, you might do some type of, on the service layer, you might do some type of change, so it might not be user. And this is where the common comes into place for me. I like to keep certain things as a common, but you could also keep it inside your DTO. Everyone has preferences on this one. If you have anything sensitive in your user, like if you don't want to actually send back the password, you might want to clean that up before you send it back. So just keep that in mind when you're sending back and forth information, and depending upon what you want to do. So if you're using Auth0, this isn't a thing you have to worry about. Auth0 will take care of your user logging in, and then there's not much that you need to send back. You may want to, in general, keep track of the user that's logged in. So there's the problem, is I've been writing C# a long time, but only recently have I been building APIs from scratch. It's probably one of the, I think, struggles that you can run into as a developer, is you'll sit down and there are different levels and pieces of writing C#. So standalone, you can build standalone applications and never build an API. You can write little small applications that do a bunch of stuff and interact with databases and never write an API. So I've been personally trying to spend more time really diving into building my own APIs. And there's the problem. Same thing with the front end. You can be like, I know JavaScript, and then spend a bunch of time writing, then find out that you don't understand all of the layers of an API with, you don't understand all the layers of an API when you go to do a Node application. So it's one of the things I think that can be very helpful to developers to kind of start to dive into this stuff, hopefully on their own. And I myself ran into some of these things in recent years where people, hi kitty cat, I have a little kitty cat, where there is an expectation of, just because I've been doing C# for years, including building standalone applications, so forth and so on, that I also am a master of building APIs from scratch in C#. And there just isn't a need. If you work for a company, unless you're building the C# application from scratch, there just isn't a need. You're part of a team. Somebody else, usually, again, unless you're the person who started the project, usually you come in and the project's groundwork has already been laid. They're not asking you to like deploy it, so forth and so on. If you're lucky, and I say lucky because it is. If stop clawing at my chair. If you're lucky, then what you have is you've been part of a project from the very beginning, and you've been able to walk through all the steps of deployment and building it, and know every intricate layer of it, from start to finish. But oftentimes, if you're coming in as a developer who, you've come in, the project's already started, they've deployed it for a number of years at this particular point. Is there a reason for you to know, or even have touched some of this stuff? Now, more than likely you'll add controllers, so like that's fairly normal, and adding a service or customizing a service, you'll do that. But again, one of the things, and it's one of the reasons I add this, I wanted to lay out a folder structure so people can kind of see what, if they're starting an application from scratch, how a clean architecture that's been made popular by, I forget what the gentleman's name is. Hold on a second. That's made popular by Robert Martin, how that might look. And I wanted to kind of give commands that kind of walk you through how you might set up your application to do all of these things. Just because, again, I think that many new developers, unless somebody is like, you'll see this structure and you'll just be like, all right, cool. Like I've looked at tons of structures in my programming career and been like, all right, cool. I see how you laid things out, and that's how you feel about it. And I didn't even think about it. I'm like, cool. It's what you did. I get you. And then other companies didn't lay it out that way, and I'm like, all right, cool. That's how you did it. And then someone comes along and is like, you need to know clean architecture. What? Why? To what end? Like, more than likely, if I'm in charge, yes, like I might head in this direction. But more than likely, unless you're coming in as the lead architect or you're in charge of the project, you more than likely don't have any control over the folder structure. Somebody else who has been with the company longer than you has already laid it all out for you, and they're like, this is the approach we're going to take. And you kind of come in and you're like, all right, cool. And then other people within the company will feel very strongly about where things go, and so forth and so on. So that's some of the things that, and again, I don't know. You just conform. And yes, you can push back and be like, guys, I don't like the way we did this, but like, will they actually listen to you, and how much will people really care? Nope, I don't have a user yet, so you'll just have to accept that. And there it is, log in. And string email address and string password. So this might be where your how you might lay out your public interface. Nothing too weird or unusual. We don't have a user class declared. We have our interfaces in the domain folder. That's fine. I think that's it. And then we'll go ahead and use you in our infrastructure project. So we'll come over here, we'll do user service.cs. I'm thinking of picking up C# because I'm going to be bachelor's degree in software engineering, and they have a C#. C# is not hard to learn from if you're doing it by yourself and you're just writing a simple program. When you're doing something like this, there are a bunch of layers that I They're distinctly C sharp, and I don't necessarily think people should be included. So there's a complicated discussion, I think, that is happening that other people may disagree with, but I think that is happening in our development community where people are like, do you know this language? And then, do you know this framework? And I think that discussion is kind of getting blurred. So one can be very strong in JavaScript, but not know Node. Like, yes, I can be knowledgeable in JavaScript and have written in JavaScript for years and never used Node. But then people are like, well, then you don't know JavaScript. And you're like, so Node is an application to run JavaScript. Just because I don't know the Node commands and what have you doesn't mean I don't know JavaScript. Or, being good at JavaScript and then being like, well, React. Again, React is a framework, and just because I don't know React doesn't mean I don't know JavaScript. Now, you could sit down and say, well, React is just JavaScript. Sure, and then, in the same way that, Japanese and English are just languages, but I feel like if you're a native English speaker, Japanese is just not something that you just pick up. And vice versa as well. There's a great distinction between them as just quote unquote languages. So I think that there are differences in being familiar with that. And React has its own approaches and own hooks and functions that are built into it that are just not native JavaScript. Now, yes, the underlying architecture and all of the pieces to it, like, oh, well, this is a giant function. Oh, I get this. And inside that function, you can have functions inside functions, and I get that too. But use callback isn't something that exists inside native JavaScript, nor does use effect, nor does use state. Native JavaScript doesn't have built-in Redux, so that's not a thing that you can really expect to interact with on a normal basis or understand how the life cycle of React components work. Yes, again, it is still underlyingly JavaScript, but it is not necessarily what I would call your normal, like, oh, on a Tuesday, if you master JavaScript, you mastered React. You only do that if you've had the time to dive into the deeper pieces of React, and be like, all right, now that I have looked through all the base code, I now know exactly what I'm doing. We are now in infrastructure. Yeah, infrastructure. But I think you should be fine. It shouldn't be too hard to pick up. It is again fairly different. It's strongly typed, so I don't know how strongly. I don't remember off the top of my head how strongly typed Swift is. But if you're used to JavaScript, it will be a pain. If you're used to TypeScript, it's a little bit easier transition, but C# is strongly typed. So we would have our user service here. Now, inside here, if we were to have any other services, we would include them in here. And again, there's kind of, let's see. There's kind of two different approaches that one can take to this. Let's see if I can pull it up. Yeah, there it is. There's kind of two different approaches that one can take to services, and it's the same way. It's the same way with your controller. So you can either do this, where you say that this is a iUser service, and then build out the yeah, there we go. You can either build out the iUser service as its own thing, so you don't have anything inside of it, and then what you would do is say something along the lines of if you did have any other, services in here, you might be like, I something service. Yeah. So you do like, like something. And then inside here, you could just do underscore. And again, this is it's something along the lines of this. So you might say private read only. I something, if you had another service, I something service, and you would do underscore something service. And this is only if you have other services. Let's say you had other ones that you wanted to include in here, and then you would say something along the lines of I something service, something service, and then inside of here you would say, for your class definition, you would say underscore something service equals something service. That is one approach to it. You can just combine it into one, and this is a user preferences and a team preference. So you can, instead of doing this separation, just say I something service and just put it in here. Like you don't have to separate it out into README versus not. But that's if you want to. And the thing that I find easiest is to create my interface first, and then just copy it and do like public async task, and then you don't have to futz around with all of that. Now, one of the things that I did forget to do, I won't say forgot, I hadn't planned on it, but I guess I will, is I need to create, let's say, based on our folder structure here, and based upon what you want to call it. So remember, the different teams call it different things. You have, your domain has its own interfaces, and it can, and we have that. But also in here, you could put in your entities. So if you're using Entity Framework, here is where your entities would go. Some people call them models. We'll call it entities in here, and we'll create our new user entity, user.cs. And of course, the same general logic applies. If you're using like Visual Studio, it will help you with all of this. Writer will help you with all of this. And when I say help you with all of this, it will create like your namespaces for you if you right click and say like new class rather than new file. So we have our .NET sample. This is going to be domain, and this is going under entities, if I can spell it right. And this, again, you'd create your public class. So one of the things that's nice about some of the ORMs in, say, Node, like Mongoose and Sequelize, is that they will build your database for you, wherein Entity does not by default build it for you. You actually have to run commands to go ahead and have it build your database for you. So I don't have Entity included in this one, but if you did, let's see if I have the commands lying around. I thought I did. I think I do. Yeah. I wait, hold on. Yeah, so you would have to do something along these lines, and I'll put an example here in the commands. You'd have to do something along the lines of this. So you would do create something along the lines of create user, or create user with a capital C, the starting project that you want to use, which would be APA, and you'd output it somewhere. So this would create the migration for you, and then when you want to actually do the migration, you actually have to run a separate command. Now you can have it so that when you run your program.cs, it will automatically run any migrations that you've created, but you still have to you still have to create the base migration. It won't just look and say, hey, your database is missing some tables, we added it for you. So that is one of the things that isn't built into Entity that people might find a bit of a pain if they're used to something like SQLize or Mongoose. I don't know about the Python ORMs, and I don't know about the Rust ORMs, but I thought that was it's a little bit of a letdown. But Entity is still very, very strong. So let's do our public. Yeah, let's do our public class user. But yeah, the TypeScript is very similar to C#. You create entities and classes and interfaces for all the things that you want to use. You don't have to, but it becomes very helpful and uses those quite a lot. So it also doesn't have, if you're used to JavaScript, there are a couple things that it doesn't have built into it that I wish it did. But I'm probably the only one who feels that way. It has its own. So in JavaScript and in TypeScript, you can do empty checks by just doing if, whatever variable is to say whether it's true or not. You can't do that in C#. You need to define whether it's a string. So if it's a string, you would do string dot is null or white space. I can't do it in here because it's going to complain. Services. Yeah. So you could do string dot. Yeah. So if string dot is null or white space email address, you could do it that way. If you want to do a null check, though the null is the same in JavaScript, if email address is null, works just fine. But sometimes, because I work with JavaScript a bunch, I always want to do this. Like if email address, what? No, you can't do that. That's not a thing. Little things like that. Link is probably the closest that you would have to the approaches that you would have in, say, array functions. So if you wanted to do in JavaScript, you could do, there's still a for each, but you might be like, you could take an I enumerable and do like dot where and then create a lambda or ambiguous function to pull information out that way. So you could do that type of stuff. It won't be hard to learn. I think it'll be tough to get used to the practice, and it can feel a little, I get them confused, not in like a bad way, but just like if I've been staring at TypeScript all day, then sometimes I fall back on like, oh, wait, that's not a thing in C#. It's not a thing in C#. And it's not like I don't know it. I just, remembering the switch right off the top of my head can be a bit of a pain. Where was I? Let's create the simplest of users. String and a password. Cool. And then on our user service, let's bring in you. And so this is the other thing that, again, depending upon the tool that you're using, Visual Studio Code isn't bad. It gives you these little windows, and these little like light bulbs. And again, some people prefer namespace above using versus using above namespace. I don't know if it really matters. It's a preference by your team. But as you can see, now that we've brought in entities from domain, our user no longer has those red squiggly lines. And then we could come over here to our user service when we need to bring in that tool as well. And it'll usually help you. And we just it will complain and it will let you know that, when certain things, so that's kind of nice. And yeah, we could just return new user. We don't have anything. Yeah, we could just do this. We don't really have anything. I don't have an await. Normally, this would be like a database call with entity, but I don't have anything going along those lines. But this might be what you would look at. There's your user service. There's your user controller. And it is grumpy about it is an action result, not. And we need to import our, there it is, quick fix. So every time you add anything in here, it wants it. Oh dear. So nothing interesting. Quick fix. There we go. So now we have our user interface. We don't have any null checks. We probably should. And again, these are just things that you can kind of add in. You can either choose to suppress them or you can do a null check. Again, like I said, if you're using the login DTO and you add in the piece that I added in here, it will not let invalid models come in. And so generally you don't have to worry about this. But that's, it's a preference on your side. Now, what we haven't done is after creating both the iUser service and this piece, you also have to, for .NET to run in here, you have to add those pieces into your you have to add those pieces into your program.cs. So that means coming in here and doing builder.services.addScoped. And then you would put in your user service. And this just allows for the dependency injection. And that is one thing that I must admit you don't see as much in the JavaScript and TypeScript community. You do start to see it with, say, Nest.js, if you've ever heard of Nest.js. Nest.js does have dependency injections, and it pretty much, I don't want to say it sets it up exactly, but by forcing you to put things into modules and then adding the modules to the main module, it forces a similar behavior. So if you've gotten used to Nest.js with TypeScript, program.cs will behave in a similar way. Every time you create a interface and a service for your particular application, you will then need to add it into program.cs. Sure. Domain, entities, user. Let's clean up user interface then. We don't actually have a task at this point. And again, a task would be used when you actually have some type of call to your database. In our particular instance, we don't have any calls to our database. So we could just, if we wanted to more so mimic how this would break out, for this we would say return OK user service. And yeah, it gets grumpy about that stuff. This is one of the things that I'm not always happy about with .NET Core is, and I run into it the same thing with this. We don't always have await methods for anything, for everything. So, and there isn't a really need to wait for our user service because we're not doing anything. Now, I think what I would do to kind of expand on this is if you wanted to add in, let's say, entity core into your application, you come into your infrastructure layer. Where am I at? I'm in domain. Too many folders. I'd come into my infrastructure layer, similar to what you see in your folder structure. And you see how we have your context DB and so forth and so on. You'd break out that. So infrastructure, new folder, we'd create our data layer, and in here we might create our app. So you might do something like app DB context. And again, you might have multiple contexts depending upon what you're trying to do. And of course, we have to follow along with what we've been doing, so we create our namespace. And I always forget the name of our application, which is silly because I'm the one who named it .NET Sample, and we're in infrastructure, and we're in data. And if we were to use entity, we would do something like using core.entities. We'll have to import I did already import that library, cool. And then I would say using Microsoft.entity framework core. And down here we would create our public class app DB context. It does need to be DB context. Don't forget that. Otherwise, it will complain, and it will be very, very grumpy about it. It's been complaining about this core entities. I guess we don't actually need it these days. And so then you might do something along the lines of this. No, not that. Public. You would do app DB context. And you would define your DB context options here. And I don't have any specific app DB context options here. I just don't have any options. You would, and it depends upon what options you might need for your database to connect. But I don't have any at the moment. And then for each of the pieces that you want to add, so let's say you wanted to add in the user, you would say public DB set user, and that's the main class. But then you would define what your table is, so it would be users, or how you would consistently refer to it in around your database or around your application. So whenever you go to, oops, I'm sorry, that should be a curly bracket. So whenever you go to use it inside, there are a couple other things. Before we get out of this, if an entity, unlike say others, now there are multiple layers to this. If this is the code first way of doing entity, which means that you're using code to define all the behaviors of your particular database. If you're doing code first, you would, for instance, this is a function or method, because it's methods inside classes. That you would use if you, let's say you wanted to have it so that users need to be unique. You would come over here and do something along the lines of model builder. You would say entity. You would say your user table. And you would then say something along the lines of has index. And again, here's where you would come up with the anonymous function. Generally, people would use something like U for users, and you would say you would create a new index well, yeah, you could say has index. You could do new if you were going to combine two things, but you would just say u dot email address, and you might then say something like is unique, and that would force that would keep it from allowing you to that would keep you from having to that would allow you to force a unique only allow unique email addresses. What are we going to be about? Oh, it's on model creating, not O model creating. So this is what you would do. So let's say we're doing DB first, or I'm sorry, code first. You'd create your users, and then you're like, well, I only want to allow one user per email address. You would do something along the lines of this. So that would allow you to force only email addresses, only one unique email address per user. So then, if we were to then use this example and come over here to our user service, we would then say in here, and again, like I said, there's two approaches that you could take. You could either do inside your service up above. You could either do two approaches. You could say, again, private read only app db context underscore context, and then you could do something along the lines, and again, you have a choice, so you can go this way. So you would say public user service, and then you would say appdb context, and then you would say underscore context equals context. But you don't need to do that. It's just not. It's not necessary. You really can just do, this. You really can just go much more simpler these days and just say appdb context, and then get rid of the rest of this stuff, and then reference it here. So if you wanted to actually return something, so let's say you wanted to get a particular user, we could do return await context. And remember, we added it, so it's going to be users, just like we have over, where'd it go? Where did it go? Move you, close you, close you, close you. Where did it go? There it is. So remember, we called it users over here. So then it would be, and if you wanted to get a, find one, you could do find async, and then we could say the email address. And at that point, we would then say task users. It's going to complain about the possibility that it could be null. So you could say var user equals, and I would probably change this to found user, but you have it's a preference. And you would do return found user equal to null, new user, and you can use ternaries here, or found user. Null check can be simplified, and it's nice. I like these. They're helpful, these little quick fixes. And then of course we need to change our interface to match as well. Services, data, infrastructure, so many folders. There it is. So now we need to change you over to a task that returns a user. And then we have to change our controller as well. So you would now be in a wait. And it's still going to complain about the fact that these might be null. Again, you can clean these up using a similar approach. Something along the lines of var, we'll call you email address is going to be equal to login details dot email address or string dot empty yeah. And I'm sorry, it's question mark. And then that reduces the fact that it's null, and we can do the same thing for password. Again, I don't recommend going this direction. I recommend using the validation to not let it be empty before it even hits this point. And we've already implemented that. So there we go. Now we don't have any orange squiggly lines. It's happy about our user service. It's happy about our interface, and it's happy about our user service. And of course, we have our DB context here. And like I said, in normal circumstances, Entity Framework does not create it for you. So what you would have to do is, knowing this was the case, you'd have to do .NET migrations, create user, start up project. There are a couple pieces that I'm excluding in this, and that is I'm not including, there are a couple pieces that I'm excluding in this. So let me go ahead and do that now. One, if we were to set this up in our app settings or app settings development JSON, we would put our connection string. So we would do something along the lines of this. We'd have our connection string. You can have more than one. And you might do something along the lines of some, we'll call it just some connection string. And we'll leave it blank for now. So you would put something in here, and then in your program.cs, you actually need to connect it all together. So you would come over here. Usually I like to do it right up here after our creator. Is I would say builder dot services dot add db context, and this is where you would have in your app, add in your app db context. Now again, depending upon what library you're using, this is where this comes into play. You would do options, and then again, to kind of keep it all on the same, kind of keep it clear and understanding, you would do options dot. Now I'm using, again, Postgres, but you would use your own whatever library you're using, whether it's MySQL or MariaDB, which are pretty much the same, and I think use the exact same library. Whatever, you have your choice. You can even use a file locally. Then you would do builder dot configuration dot get connection string, and you would just need to name it. So ours is called some connection string. So we'd come over here and say, wait, that's wrong. Someone put it in the right space. Oh, come on. There we go. Some connection string. And don't forget your semicolon. And that would allow you to connect your database to that. Now again, that doesn't solve everything. You still have to put your connection string in here. And depending upon, so it looks a little different than some people might be used to if they're used to JavaScript. You would do something along the lines of host equals the name of your host, so localhost. You would then do a port, and it depends on what your port is. By default, I think Postgres is 5432. You'd pick a database if you wanted to. And it looks a little different depending upon what particular thing you're connecting to. So you do a database. I don't have a database. Something, username, something, and then password. So we're just, there we go. So that would allow you to connect to your database, tie it into your program.cs, and then you can go ahead and run the commands to do the migration, and then run the command to do the update. If you want to have it so that it automatically does those for you at the start of your application, you have to build that in. And see if I have some code. I do. This is an example of how you might do that. Let's see. Yeah, I have it. This is an example of how you might do that. And you would do that after, in your program.cs, after builder.build. You would come in here and say, go ahead and create a scope, and do the database.migrate, and then make sure to log any errors that you want to log, and this will automatically run the migrations for you after you create them. But again, you still have to manually create the migrations. It won't just automatically do that for you. So that's kind of the basics. Again, I don't expect anyone to know all of this. There are two things that I forgot. Two things. If we're using, there are two things that I forgot. One, map controllers. You need that to tie in your controllers that we've created in our controllers. And you do need the use authorization and use authentication if you're using that. Now, I would say for your first application, just, exclude these two things. Exclude the authorized, that is. There's not a need. But, of course, if you're doing something like this on a different level, then you want to have authentication, authorization, and you might want to do something like auth0, and auth0 explains a lot of this stuff to you, so you don't have to memorize or know this stuff. It'll point out to you that you need to use authenticate and use authorization. If you're just doing your first application and you're just trying to figure it all out, don't authorize on your first endpoint. You just don't need it. It'll add headaches for you down the road, and this just get the basics down first before you try to add an authorization, unless you particularly want a challenge. So this is kind of a simple basic structure. I'll drop it over on my GitHub so people can kind of see how it works. Let's go ahead and test it though. Let's make sure that I didn't mess anything up. Oh no, I can't. I don't have a database. We'll just leave it as a sample. So yeah, I'll still put it up on my GitHub. So yeah, there's nothing in here that's particularly scathing or revealing. And this does use .NET 8. Now that's one thing that you might want to keep in mind, Mr. John Wonder, is there's slight variations depending upon which version of .NET you're running. So some of the older versions of .NET don't have a program.cs. They have a startup.cs. But the later versions after, I think, 3, or is it 6? I think it's 6, use program.cs. So just keep that in mind. And for the classes may actually teach you standalone C#, which are, Windows Forms applications versus web APIs. So, yeah, anyway, I'll put this up on my GitHub, like I said, and I think I'll close it off for there tonight, and I'll go back to doing my JavaScript reverse bullet hell that I was working on before. Yeah, I hope everyone has a good evening. I might do more tutorials like this from time to time, and if anyone wants anything specific, please feel free to ask in my YouTube channel, or drop me a line here in Twitch, and I can try to do a specific tutorial on something if you want. I'm not a master of all programming languages. Mainly I do C#, JavaScript, TypeScript, and some PHP, but not as much as I used to. So anyway, I hope everyone has a good evening. It is 10:08 p.m. on February 5th, 2024. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you have a good